Hello, outcasts. Welcome to Insanity Collection's Stories to be Murdered by. These dark and original stories are intended to help you fall deep into sleep, deep into unconsciousness. In this episode, we have chilling COVID-19 stories for you. Story 1, All Fours. It was getting out of hand now. After the outburst of the coronavirus, people had not taken the precautions. Now the world suffered the consequences. Andrew, who was an assistant at the lab, was working on finding the cure for it and had observed the horrifying changing nature of the virus. He had been taking notes and had volunteered for assistant himself, as he was highly interested in getting to know more about the virus. He had always heard that the coronavirus had been artificially released on the world, as if a conspiracy had been hatched, so he wanted to see if it was true or not. As the days went by, thousands of people died every day in front of Andrew's eyes. He had seen the light leave the infected people's eyes. Their struggles for the breaths that refused to come had left Andrew traumatized. Everyone hoped for tomorrow to be better than today, but it was actually getting worse by each passing second. The doctors had worked day and night to find the cure or the vaccine for it. Andrew had been working days and nights without breaks. He wanted it to be over already, but nothing was working. They would bring the infected people and keep them there for days, experimenting on them, injecting them with different vaccines they had prepared without caring about the consequences. Andrew did not like what was going on in the laboratory. He tried to speak up for the senior doctors to stop the madness, because it was not fair of them to inject the patients without informing them of what was being injected. He was always silenced by them, with certain comments that told him to keep quiet and do his job, that he was inexperienced and did not know what he was talking about. Andrew was so disheartened by the environment created around him that he decided to remain quiet. Time went by, and nothing worked at all. The virus grew stronger and stronger, taking away half the world's population. It was now the beginning of the year 2021, when they started experimenting with a new chemical that was supposed to merge with the blood and kill the virus. No one had seen it coming. Everything seemed okay at first. It was tested on a 40-year-old man, Steve. The night that he was injected with the vaccine was the night Andrew had to stay with him for the purpose of observation in case of any changes that might take place in Steve's condition. Andrew sat with his protective suit on beside Steve's bed, taking notes like the seniors had told him to. There was just minor noticeable changes at first. For instance, Steve's heartbeat became a lot faster than it was supposed to be. Later, his breathing became hitched and short. He was taking in insanely short breaths and started to breathe rapidly. The later changes included his temperature going higher and higher. Andrew took notes of these and called a doctor to notify him of the weird condition, but he was rudely told that it was normal. After the call, he sat down uselessly as there was nothing much to be observed. The clock ticked by and the sky grew darker. Andrew was slowly being engulfed by the realm of dreams. He was so tired from the hectic routine of the day that even the chair he sat on seemed like a blessing to him. He gradually slid down the seat and rested his chin on his chest. The last scene he remembered was Steve peacefully sleeping, and then Andrew fell asleep as well. He had a very uncomfortable dream that was keeping him restless. It was so noisy and chaotic. There were voices and sounds of things breaking when he suddenly came back to consciousness. He still sat in that chair, only the room was pitch black and it smelled so bad in there that it burnt his lungs. Andrew panicked and worried for Steve. The power was out and Steve would be suffering. He stumbled his way back to the bed and noticed it was empty. Steve was too weak and unstable to move, which confused Andrew a lot. He called out for someone because he had no idea what was going on. While he was at it, he heard a strange groan from the farther corner of the room. It was similar to a wild animal's sound. Andrew moved, and at the same time, the lights came on. He saw Steve facing the corner, and the groans were coming from Steve himself. He stood on all fours, and his body twitched again and again, as if it were having a seizure. He did not even look human anymore. There was disgusting yellowish froth coming out of his mouth. "It's that stupid chemical," Andrew exclaimed, and Steve looked back and started coming for him like a rabid dog. He ran out and locked the door and took his phone to notify the seniors. As he turned around, facing away from the locked door, there were a bunch of other corona patients moving through the hallway, their conditions similar to Steve's. The doctors had injected the same vaccines in them too. Each of them moved on all fours, extremely fast and wild. They had started fighting among themselves, biting pieces off each other. There was blood, and the froth from their mouths sprayed everywhere. Andrew gasped, and their heads turned towards him. They started coming towards him, and he made a run for the opposite direction in the hope to reach the lab, which was the safest place right now. He barged in on the doctors that had worry painted on their faces, barely making his way in, as the wild mutated patients were hot on his heels. They had a meeting, and they apologized to Andrew because now the situation had become even worse. They were stuck in the lab and had to find a cure for this before they starved, or got infected and turned into the mutated creatures that were trying to break into the lab. All of them, including Andrew, set to work immediately. A very COVID Halloween. After 230 days of quarantine, the youngsters were ready to go. Halloween was happening, and Bernie was searching his costume chest to find the perfect disguise. "Have you put your costume together?" asked Mum. "Yes, I'm going as a dragon." He proudly held up a black shirt that had spikes along the back, and a decorative piece of glass that would be his treasure. "Perfect. Don't forget the mask. We're still under social distancing restrictions." "Yes, Mum." He placed the items on his bed. He glanced at the clock, but there was still plenty of time left. Tony was bouncing his basketball on the pavement. He was going to be a basketball star when he grew up. The NBA had started up again in July. "Hey, Tony," called out Savannah, walking past. "What are you wearing tonight?" "Me? Nothing." "Okay," she said hesitantly, "but you might get arrested." "Halloween sucks, and you need lots of makeup," he called out. She laughed. Dumb bullies didn't bother her. He was missing out on free candy and fun, so more would be left for her. She was trying to get home in time for dinner, but everyone said hi to her. Sometimes she wished she were nerdy, like her friend Tony, rather than being the popular girl. Finally, she was home. She still hadn't decided on a costume. Should she go as a princess? A witch? She yawned. So dull. When she arrived home, the kitchen was in disarray. "Sorry, dear, a pipe burst," said Dad. "Is the plumber coming?" she asked. "I can only hope." "Why is the water spewing all over the place? Didn't you turn the valves off?" "What's a valve?" asked Dad. She went under the kitchen sink and twisted the valves off. "Well, that's why you're smart like Mom. I'll go get the mop." She didn't want to stick around to clean up the mess, so she decided to head upstairs where it was a water-free zone and try to figure out her costume. There were always the early kids who went trick-or-treating in North Augusta, South Carolina. They barely even waited until sundown. This was a friendly and safe middle-class neighborhood. There hadn't been many COVID-19 cases in this part of town. The only one had been a family that had traveled to Florida for vacation, then came back home. They had been put into quarantine. They were all recovering nicely, but the parents didn't notice when their little boy Brian went missing. Now Brian was having a party at the end of the block with all his friends. Each child was dressed in a costume. Everyone was excited to see Brian again after several months of social distancing. Brian still had a bad cough, but he figured that his big plastic mask would keep the germs in. Unfortunately, the plastic mask had holes for nose and mouth and wasn't the protective type. "It's weird, but one day I'd feel great, the next sick, then better again," he was telling all the kids. "Scary. But you're well now?" one little girl asked. "Yes, just this lingering cough. But I had a test done yesterday and it came back normal." "Wow. Yeah, this virus is smart. I heard it's been mutating." "But into something less serious, I heard," said Bernie, joining in on the fun. "Yes, it'll become like a little cold." "Hey babies," called out Tony, walking past. "Aren't you guys too old for Halloween?" He bounced his ball on the pavement, proudly wearing his Larry Bird jersey. "Just like you must be ancient to wear that Larry Bird jersey. Isn't he dead now?" asked Savannah, joining in. "Nope, but he is a legend." Then Tony took off after his escaped ball. Savannah and Bernie headed out, deciding to collect all the candy before the other kids did. Soon, Brian's little party broke up. Brian stood there, trying to decide which house to go to first. But then he felt very strange, very light, smooth. He looked down at himself. His ghost costume became real. His body was opaque, like a ghost. "Cool," he said, heading off to the first house. Even though Bernie and Savannah didn't hang out together at school, they always did after school. They didn't think twice when they heard screaming coming down the street. After all, you were supposed to scream on Halloween. At the end of the street, children were running around and crying. One little boy was dressed as a werewolf, and he shape-changed right there. One moment he was wearing a costume, the next he looked like a real werewolf. He took after Brian, his claws swiping at the little boy, but Brian no longer had a real body. "Savannah, look out!" cried Bernie. A short vampire reached out to bite her. She pushed him away. She was taller than the vampire, who ran off after another child. "What's happening?" she cried. "I'm not sure, but I think the COVID-19 has mutated. Instead of giving people respiratory illness, it's turned them into whatever creature they were dressed up as." They watched as the little girl dressed as a cat turned into a cat. She dropped to the ground on all fours and meowed. "Well, that doesn't matter for some, but some of these kids are dressed as scary creatures." "I know. Quick, take off your clothes." "Excuse me? Oh." She realized he meant the costume. She quickly tossed her fairy costume on the ground while he dropped his dragon costume. "I think we should go home where it's safe. I think if we get this strain, we'll permanently morph into our costumes." "This is definitely an interesting night for those not social distancing," said Savannah. The pair of friends headed down the street. "Hey Tony," she called out. They watched as Tony morphed into a tall basketball player before their eyes. "Say what?" he said gleefully. He took down the street, bouncing his ball. "Now I really am Larry Bird." "Weird. Let's go." They reached her house first. Dad was still mopping up the water. Savannah ran down to the basement to grab some tools and supplies to fix the sink. She raced back upstairs. "Look," she said, pointing at the tool belt that contained a plumber's wench. "Is that such a good idea?" Bernie watched as she turned into a plumber. Actually, she just grew a bit older and smarter. A variety of tools and supplies had magically appeared in Dad's unused tool belt. Dad watched quite perplexed as she quickly removed the broken pipe from under the sink. "See, it's not all bad," she said. "I don't mind staying this way." "That gives me an idea too," Bernie said. "Meet me on the street in 15. He raced off to his house. Inside, he ran into the closet and grabbed his mum's lab coat. He found some of her spare test tubes and her microscope. In the case COVID-19 didn't know who he was, he said, "I'm a COVID scientist. I shall find the cure." He got to work. Outside, it was a mess. The police had come to try and sort it out. They were confused as to why all these mythical creatures were now real. They had to capture them alive, as they knew beneath their disguises that they were still little children. After all the outrage of harming people at the Portland and New York protests, they knew they had to handle this properly. And the public had yet to find out. 2 minutes later, Bernie, as a COVID-19 scientist, raced into the street. "I might have the cure," he called out. "Who's first?" He held out a bucket of candies. The vampire came up to him. "I'll try, as I'm famished, but no one will let me bite them." He took a candy and ate it. Nothing happened. "Darn it. Well, better luck next time." Soon, all the children and the adults were taking a candy. It had no effect on any of them. "Any candy left?" Tony asked. "I thought you wanted to be a famous basketball star," asked Savannah. "I want to be Tony the basketball star, not Larry Bird's twin." Tony took at least 5 candies and tossed them in his mouth. Nothing happened. "So much for that," said Bernie. "And there are no candies left," said Savannah. "I guess it's back to work," said Bernie, heading for home. In the distance, they could hear the screams of children and adults as the disease spread. The end.